Welcome back to the Alibi Club, where every mystery is a case file waiting to be reopened. In the sultry nights of early 20th century New Orleans, the air itself seemed alive with music. Jazz poured from every corner, brass horns and piano keys filling the humid streets with rhythm. But in 1918 and 1919, that rhythm was joined by something else. The sound of fear. A man, known only as the Axeman, stalked the city. He broke into homes, left families bleeding, and vanished into the night without ever being caught. His crimes were brutal, his presence terrifying, and his legend unforgettable. But what made him different from other killers was the strange letter he wrote, declaring he would spare any household that played jazz loudly enough for him to hear. For a city built on music, it was a command both surreal and chilling: play jazz to save your life. Tonight, we revisit the haunting story of the Axeman of New Orleans, where music, murder, and mystery collided in a way history has never forgotten. New Orleans in the early 20th century was unlike any other American city. By day, its French Quarter bustled with markets, vendors, and the mingling voices of Creole, Italian, and Cajun families. By night, the city transformed into something almost magical. Gas lamps flickered along the narrow streets, and music, real, vibrant, unstoppable music, spilled from dance halls and bars. Jazz was being born here, not in polished concert halls, but in crowded rooms where musicians played with sweat on their brows and improvisation in their blood. It was a city alive, a city that seemed to never sleep. But in 1918, the rhythm of New Orleans faltered. The people, who had once walked freely in the glow of night, began locking their doors early. They whispered in cafes, glanced nervously over their shoulders, and pressed shutters closed against the dark. For something moved among them, not just the ordinary crime of a city port, not the drunken scuffles that police broke up after midnight, but something colder, more deliberate, a figure who would come to be known only as the Axeman. The first attacks puzzled police. Families were found in their homes, their doors forced open or windows pried apart. Victims lay bleeding in their beds, struck by an axe that seemed to appear from the shadows and vanish just as quickly. Sometimes the weapon was left behind, sometimes it belonged to the household itself, seized from a shed or pantry. What chilled investigators most was not just the brutality of the blows, but the eerie lack of motive. Money and jewelry were often untouched. Sometimes nothing at all was taken. The killer seemed to come only to harm, and then disappear back into the dark. For a city accustomed to crime, this was different. These attacks did not feel random. They felt like a pattern, though no one could discern what the pattern was. The victims came from different neighborhoods, different walks of life. Though many were Italian grocers and their families, police whispered about vendettas, about organized crime, but nothing explained the randomness of the violence. Newspapers began to take notice. Headlines blared of axe murders and mysterious intruder. Ordinary citizens began to dread the night, listening for the smallest creak of wood or rattle of glass. Fathers sat awake with shotguns by the door. Mothers hushed their children and prayed. Yet the Axeman seemed untouchable, able to slip into any home and vanish again without leaving a clear trail. It wasn't just the violence that set him apart. It was the atmosphere he created. Each new attack seemed to feed the city's growing paranoia. The French Quarter, once alive with laughter and brass bands, now echoed with something heavier. Musicians still played, but behind every note lingered unease. Doors were locked earlier, streets emptied faster. People began to feel that they were living in a story where danger could strike any house, any family, at any time. The police, under pressure, tried to calm the public. They investigated. They made arrests. They pointed fingers, but suspects often proved innocent. Evidence melted under scrutiny, and the Axeman remained in the shadows. Each failure only made the fear sharper. Each unsolved crime pushed the city further into panic. And then came the strangest twist of all. In March of 1919, a letter arrived at the offices of the local newspaper, written in a taunting, theatrical style. It claimed to be from the Axeman himself. In it, he declared that he was a spirit, a demon from hell, and that he planned to strike again. But there was a bizarre condition. Any household that played jazz loudly on the night of his next attack would be spared. He wrote that he had a fondness for jazz, that no harm would come to those who filled their homes with music. The letter was printed, and the city erupted. Fear gave way to a surreal night in which nearly every home, bar, and dance hall blasted jazz into the darkness. Bands were hired on the spot, musicians played into the early hours, and New Orleans, terrified yet defiant, became a city of music louder than death itself, and true to the promise, no one who played jazz was harmed that night. The Axeman's crimes would continue, but that letter, bizarre, arrogant, chilling, ensured his legend would never fade. For in the heart of New Orleans, music had been both a shield and a sentence, a way of turning terror into rhythm, if only for a single night. And so the city became divided in memory, before the Axeman, and after the Axeman. Before, when jazz was joy, after, when jazz became survival. The shadow of the Axeman first fell over New Orleans in May 1918. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, Italian grocers, were found in their home on Upper Line Street. The door had been forced open, the couple attacked while they slept. Joseph's throat had been slit, and Catherine had been struck repeatedly with an axe. The weapon, a bloody razor, was found discarded, while the axe belonging to the Maggios themselves was left in the backyard. The brutality was shocking, even for a city used to crime. But what unsettled investigators most was the absence of reason. Money and valuables lay untouched. Whoever had entered had come only for violence. The murder shocked the neighborhood, and rumors spread fast. Some whispered of mafia vendettas, others of a lunatic on the loose. The police, under pressure, arrested 2 of Joseph's brothers, claiming jealousy or family disputes. Yet the evidence was thin, and though suspicions lingered, nothing held firm. The case began to fade into uncertainty, but the Axeman was only beginning. Just weeks later, in June, another family was attacked. Louis Basuma and his mistress Harriet Lowe were struck with an axe while they slept above Basuma's corner store. Both survived the initial assault, though Harriet would later die from her injuries. Again, the weapon was one of the household's own, left at the scene. Again, nothing was stolen. Investigators arrested suspects, employees, acquaintances, but none were convincingly guilty. Harriet herself, before dying, accused Basuma of being a German spy, fueling wild headlines in wartime America. Yet her words felt more delirious than truthful. The randomness of the violence unsettled the city. There was no clear pattern. Families attacked in their homes, weapons left behind, valuables untouched. People began to see a phantom hand moving through New Orleans, one that struck without reason and slipped away without trace. In August 1918, the terror grew. Anna Schneider, 8 months pregnant, was attacked in her sleep. Her scalp was split, her face bruised, yet she survived. Miraculously, she gave birth just days later to a healthy child. Once again, nothing was taken. Once again, the weapon belonged to the household. The city began to panic in earnest. Then came Joseph Romano in 1919, a grocer who lived with his nieces. They awoke to his cries and found him bleeding from axe wounds, staggering through the house. Though he survived long enough to identify his attacker only as a dark figure, he soon died of his injuries. This time, neighbors reported seeing a tall man in a dark suit and hat fleeing the scene. It was the closest thing to a description the city ever had, but it was vague, shadowy, and fed the imagination more than the investigation. By now, newspapers were in a frenzy. Headlines screamed of the Axeman killer. Reporters dug into the lives of victims, trying to find connections. Many were Italian grocers or families tied to groceries, leading some to insist the attacks were mafia-related. Others saw only chaos. The Axeman seemed to kill without pattern, to strike families without motive, to disappear without logic. And with each crime, fear deepened. People who once laughed in the streets of New Orleans now bolted their doors at dusk. Shopkeepers bought weapons. Parents tucked children into bed with whispered warnings. The music that had once defined the city grew quieter, as though even jazz itself dared not rise too loudly in the night. The police, overwhelmed, arrested anyone who seemed remotely suspicious. They detained drifters, rivals, even acquaintances of victims. Some spent months in jail before being released for lack of evidence. Public trust eroded. If the police could not protect families, if suspects came and went without answers, then who was safe? The Axeman seemed to walk with impunity, mocking the very idea of justice. But what made the crimes so chilling was not just the violence. It was the silence around them. There were no screams heard before the attacks, no signs of forced robbery, no clues that could lead to an arrest. Each home was entered as though the killer melted through walls. Each exit was made without trace. New Orleans was a city alive with sound, laughter, music, traffic, and yet the Axeman moved like a ghost in its midst. By early 1919, the city lived in dread. Ordinary crime seemed to vanish from memory. No one talked about petty thefts or drunken fights. Everyone talked about the Axeman. Each night felt like a gamble, each creak of the floorboards a warning. New Orleans was a city split in two, the bright daylight where people tried to pretend life was normal, and the fearful night where they lay awake waiting for the sound of an axe. It was in this atmosphere of dread that the Axeman would make his most infamous move, a taunting letter that would turn terror into theater and fear into music. By March of 1919, New Orleans was a city strangled by fear. Families barred their doors, slept lightly, and jumped at every sound in the night. The police, overwhelmed and ineffective, had few answers to give. But then, out of the shadows, came something that twisted the story of the Axeman from crime into legend. A letter. It was received at the offices of the Times-Picayune, the city sept's most prominent newspaper, and it arrived not as a plea or a confession, but as a performance. Written in theatrical, almost mocking style, it was signed by none other than the Axeman. The letter began with bluster, declaring that he was not a mere man but a spirit, a demon from the hottest hell. He claimed he was beyond capture, untouchable, and that he alone decided who would live and who would die. But the strangest part came halfway through. The Axeman announced that on the following Tuesday night, he would once again roam the city. He promised bloodshed, but with one bizarre condition. Any home, he wrote, that played jazz music, loud enough for him to hear as he passed by, would be spared. The newspaper published the letter in full. The effect was immediate. The entire city buzzed with nervous energy. Could it be real? Was this truly the killer? Or some cruel prankster? People argued in bars, debated in shops, whispered in homes. But whether the letter was genuine or not, no one wanted to take the risk of ignoring it. On the appointed night, New Orleans transformed. Jazz poured from every home, every bar, every dance hall. Families who had never played music before bought phonographs and cranked the volume. Households without instruments invited neighbors who could play. Bands were hired on the spot to fill dance halls until dawn. Trumpets blared, clarinets wailed, pianos pounded, drums rattled. The city that had been holding its breath suddenly erupted in sound. It was music as survival, music as a shield. For one night, fear and rhythm collided. The Axeman's letter had demanded jazz, and New Orleans gave him more than he could have imagined. Some people even laughed nervously at the absurdity of it all. A killer who dictated not just death, but music. Others danced through the night, clinging to joy in the face of terror, and throughout it all, one thought echoed in every household: as long as the music plays, we live. No murders occurred that night. True to the letter's promise, the Axeman spilled no blood while jazz filled the air, and in that strange, surreal way, the city survived by obeying the demands of its phantom. The night became one of the most bizarre chapters in American crime history, a moment when a community turned its fear into music, not by choice, but by command. Now, pause for a moment. As you listen to this story, imagine what it would feel like to be in that city on that night, to sit awake, the windows open, jazz spilling into the street, wondering if a killer lurked just beyond the glow of the lamps. And let me ask you something. Where are you right now, listening to this? Is it morning or night where you are? Think about it, because fear always feels sharper when you place yourself inside the story. The letter cemented the Axeman's reputation. He was no longer just a criminal. He was a figure of myth, a phantom who controlled the heartbeat of a city, with nothing more than words on a page. Theatrics like this were rare in crime then, and still are now. Most killers sought secrecy. The Axeman sought the spotlight. He did not want to vanish into the shadows. He wanted to be feared in the open. Some believed the letter was a hoax, written by a prankster or even a jazz musician, hoping to boost business. But the city could not ignore its timing. Attacks had already left families dead, and the letter's threat felt too real to dismiss. Whether penned by the killer or not, it changed the way people thought about him forever. Historians often point out that the letter also immortalized jazz. At that time, jazz was still considered rough, even disreputable by polite society. But in March of 1919, jazz became the music that kept death away. The Axeman's demand turned it into something more than entertainment. It became a lifeline, and in its own way, that night helped solidify New Orleans as the birthplace of jazz, the city where music could defy even murder. The Axeman did not strike that night, but his silence was not mercy. It was mockery. He had proven his power, shown that an entire city could dance to his tune. literally. For those who lived through it, the fear did not end with sunrise. It only deepened, because now the killer was not just a man with an axe. He was a figure who seemed to toy with them, a predator who wrote letters from hell and made the streets echo with music against their will. And as the weeks passed, New Orleans waited for his next move, wondering if the rhythm of jazz could hold back the blade forever. The night of jazz had passed, but the shadow of the Axeman remained. For a brief moment, some citizens of New Orleans clung to a fragile hope. Perhaps the killer's theatrics had been a bluff. Perhaps the letter was nothing more than a cruel prank. Maybe the terror had finally run its course. But fear, once planted, does not die easily. The very silence that followed seemed louder than the music that had protected them. Weeks passed without an attack, and the city slowly exhaled. Bars reopened their doors. Families began sleeping more soundly, and the nightly chaos of New Orleans tried to return. But there was an unease beneath it all, an awareness that the Axeman had not been caught, had not been named, had not been brought to justice. He was still out there, somewhere in the labyrinth of narrow streets, watching, and when the music faded, he struck again. On August 10th, 1919, the screams of the Cortimiglia family shattered the fragile calm. Charles and Rosie Cortimiglia lived in Gretna, just across the Mississippi River from New Orleans. They were grocers, like so many of the earlier victims, living above their shop with their 2-year-old daughter Mary. That night, neighbors awoke to Rosie's desperate cries. When they rushed inside, the scene was horrific. Charles lay bleeding from deep axe wounds. Rosie was battered, her skull fractured, and little Mary lay dead in her crib, killed by a single swing of the axe. Rosie, though gravely injured, managed to survive. When questioned, she accused their neighbors, Orlando Giordano and his son Frank, of being the attackers. Her testimony shocked many, for the Giordanos were well known, and Frank was only 18. Both were arrested and convicted. Despite the lack of clear evidence, and despite Charles himself insisting that the Giordanos were innocent, the case tore at the Italian-American community, deepening divisions and suspicions. Only later, after Rosie recanted her testimony, were the Giordanos released. But by then, the damage was done. The Axeman had claimed another family, and the justice system had again failed to find him. This attack drove home the reality that the killer's threats were not empty. His silence after the letter had been deceptive, a pause before striking harder than before. Now the people of New Orleans knew he was not finished, that he would not vanish until he decided it was over, and worse, they realized the police were no closer to catching him than they had been at the start. Theories spread faster than facts. Some argued that the Axeman had a vendetta against Italian grocers. Others believed he killed at random, that his only motive was terror itself. Newspapers speculated wildly, filling columns with rumors of suspects and secret societies. Citizens pointed fingers at each other, desperate to believe the killer could be named, unmasked, stopped. But the truth was more frightening. He remained a phantom, faceless and free. In the nights that followed, fear returned to its full strength. People began once again to lock their doors, to keep watch in silence, to listen for the sound of footsteps or the creak of floorboards. Jazz, which had once saved the city for a night, could not save it forever. The Axeman had proven he could come back whenever he pleased, and that knowledge gnawed at the city's soul. What made the attacks so terrifying was their unpredictability. The Axeman gave no warning signs, left no trail. He could break into one family's home and leave valuables untouched, then vanish before neighbors could react. He seemed to appear and disappear at will, a shadow with an axe. Unlike ordinary criminals, he was not hunting for money or goods. He was hunting for fear itself, and in that he was always successful. The Cortimiglia attack became one of the most infamous crimes in the Axeman's reign, not just for its brutality, but for its reminder that no one, not even children, was safe. The people of New Orleans had already lived with fear, but now it deepened into despair. They began to realize the truth. Perhaps this figure could never be caught, never be stopped, never even be understood. And in that realization, the legend of the Axeman grew larger than the man himself. He was no longer just a killer. He was a ghost that slipped through keyholes, a demon who answered only to music, a nightmare that stalked the humid nights of New Orleans. The people began to speak of him in whispers, as though even saying his name too loudly might summon him. The music that once filled the city returned, but now it carried a different tone. Jazz was still joy, still life, but underneath every note lingered the reminder of that letter, that night, that bargain struck between death and rhythm. The Axeman had tied himself forever to the sound of New Orleans, and with every swing of his axe, he ensured the city would never forget the night when jazz was the difference between life and death. By late 1919, New Orleans was a city at war with its own fear. The Courtimidia murders had torn through the community, leaving behind not only grief but also division, mistrust and rage at the justice system. The arrests of the Giordanos, and the later collapse of Rosie's testimony, proved what many already believed: the police were groping in the dark. The Axeman seemed untouchable, and with every misstep of the authorities, his legend grew. The police were under immense pressure. Newspapers criticized them daily, citizens demanded action, and politicians insisted that something be done. But the very nature of the Axeman's crimes defied ordinary policing. He left behind no fingerprints, no clear footprints, no solid eyewitness accounts. He did not take money or valuables, giving detectives no motive to pursue. The axes he used were often the victim's own, left behind at the scene, clean of anything that might identify him. Every attack felt like a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and the more investigators looked, the less sense it made. Several suspects were arrested over the course of the killings. Some were drifters, men found near crime scenes with no alibi. Others were acquaintances of victims, accused by rumor more than evidence. In one case, a man named Joseph Mumphrey was whispered about as the Axeman, a shadowy figure said to have ties to organized crime. Years later, stories would claim he was killed in Los Angeles, possibly as revenge by a woman connected to one of the Axeman's victims. But these stories were tangled, contradictory, and impossible to verify. Mumphrey became more myth than man, a name that filled space in newspapers, but never in court records. The failure of the police bred paranoia among the people. Neighbors looked at one another with suspicion. Italians, already targets of prejudice, felt the double weight of being victims and suspects. The grocery trade, where so many of the Axeman's victims worked, became both dangerous and feared. Shops closed earlier. Families slept in shifts, someone always awake to listen for intruders. Guns were purchased, axes were hidden, doors reinforced. But no matter how much the city armed itself, the fear lingered. If the Axeman wanted to come, he would come. The newspapers, eager to sell copies, fed the fire. They printed rumors, exaggerated details, even outright fabrications. Stories of phantom footsteps, of windows opening without sound, of shadows glimpsed but never caught, filled their pages. Whether the journalists believed them or not, didn't matter. What mattered was that readers could not look away. The Axeman was no longer just a criminal. He was entertainment, a macabre figure who blurred the line between news and legend. What made the story all the more surreal was its connection to music. The letter had tied the Axeman forever to jazz, and the city could not separate the two. For some, jazz became a symbol of defiance, a way to show the killer that New Orleans would not be cowed. For others, it became a haunting reminder of how thin the line was between life and death. Dance halls filled again, but even as couples twirled and bands improvised, there was an edge of tension beneath the music. Every trumpet note carried the memory of the night they played for their lives. Police patrols increased, but they brought little comfort. The city was too large, its neighborhoods too dense, its nights too long. Officers could not be everywhere at once, and the Axeman seemed to know it. He struck without warning, then vanished before help could arrive. The randomness of his attacks was perhaps his greatest weapon. No one knew if he had a pattern, if he chose victims deliberately, or if he simply appeared wherever he pleased. That unpredictability turned every locked door into a question mark. By the fall of 1919, the attacks slowed, but the fear did not. Citizens waited for the next scream in the night, the next headline in the paper. Every few weeks, rumors spread that he had returned, that another family had been attacked. Some were true, others were exaggerations, but the effect was the same. The Axeman never really left. Even in silence, he held the city hostage. For investigators, the case became a nightmare. Detectives retired with nothing to show for their years of work. Files grew thicker, but answers remained absent. Every theory, mafia vendettas, mad drifters, German spies, local feuds, collapsed under scrutiny. The Axeman had no clear identity, no clear motive. He was a phantom, defined not by who he was, but by what he had done. And that is perhaps why his story has lasted so long. Criminals are caught, cases are closed, names are written in ledgers, dates in archives, but the Axeman of New Orleans slipped away. He was never photographed, never handcuffed, never forced into a courtroom. He remained instead a shape in the imagination, a dark figure with a hat, an axe glinting in the lamplight, footsteps fading into the humid night. The city moved on in time, but the legend did not. The Axeman became a piece of New Orleans folklore, his crimes retold alongside ghost stories and jazz tales, as much a part of the city's identity as its parades and its music. He left behind no answers, only fear, only myth, only the memory of nights when jazz was the only shield between life and death. When the attacks slowed after the summer of 1919, the city of New Orleans tried to return to normal. People still locked their doors, still jumped at shadows, but slowly the rhythm of life crept back in. Markets reopened fully, children played in the streets again, and the sound of jazz once more drifted freely through the humid nights. Yet even as the city healed, the legend of the Axeman began to grow larger than the man himself. For some, the Axeman became a story to frighten children, a bogeyman with an axe who would come if you misbehaved. For others, he became a ghost story told in taverns, where men leaned close over drinks and swore they had heard footsteps in the night, or seen a dark figure pass beneath their windows. But for most, he became inseparable from the very sound of jazz. That letter, arrogant, taunting, surreal, had cemented his place in the cultural fabric of the city. He was not just a killer, he was the killer who demanded music. It was almost too strange to be real, and that is why it endured. Imagine a murderer who promises mercy if you play the trumpet, who spares your life if the piano keys keep pounding. It sounds like fiction, like something from a Gothic novel, and yet it happened in New Orleans. That one night in March, when the city erupted in jazz to stave off death, became the most famous chapter in the entire saga, overshadowing even the bloodiest of his crimes. Historians would later argue that the letter might not have been written by the killer at all. Some believed it was the work of a prankster, others a journalist hungry for headlines, and still others whispered that a jazz musician had penned it as a twisted advertisement for the music he loved. But whether authentic or not, the letter took on a life of its own. The city believed it, obeyed it, lived it, and because of that, the Axeman became immortal in memory. Jazz musicians themselves embraced the story in their own way. Bands composed songs inspired by the Axeman, lyrics blending humor and horror, satire and fear. Sheet music circulated with titles like The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz Don't Scare Me Papa, written only months after the infamous letter. Audiences laughed nervously as they played it, but beneath the laughter was a shiver, because everyone remembered that night, when they really had played for their lives. In this way, the Axeman did something few criminals ever achieve. He left behind not just police files and crime scenes, but art. His crimes became music. His terror became culture. The very city he tormented transformed him into a figure of folklore, woven into the sound of jazz itself. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth, that fear and creativity can dance together, that horror can become melody. But the legend was not all romanticized. Survivors of his attacks bore scars, both physical and emotional. Families were shattered, children left without parents, parents left without children. For them, the Axeman was not myth or music. He was the sound of glass breaking in the night, the sight of blood on sheets, the loss of loved ones never to return. The newspapers could spin his story into theatrics, the musicians could write songs about him, but for those who lived through it, he was nothing more than a butcher who vanished before justice could be done. Still, myths do not ask permission. They grow where silence leaves room. The Axeman was never caught, never unmasked, never dragged before a judge. He remained faceless, and in that facelessness, people saw what they wanted to see. To some, he was a madman. To others, a mafia hitman. To still others, a demon walking the streets in a man's shape. The absence of truth became the soil in which myth took root. Over the years, as New Orleans changed, the Axeman stayed. His story was retold in books, in films, in ghost tours, through the French Quarter. Guides led visitors through narrow streets, pointing to houses where the Axeman was said to have struck, recounting the night when jazz filled every block. Tourists shivered at the thought, and locals nodded, as if to say, yes, this is our story, dark and strange as it may be. Even now, more than a century later, the Axeman is remembered not simply as a criminal, but as a part of the city's identity. His crimes have become folklore, his legend part of the rhythm of New Orleans. In a city where music never dies, neither do its ghosts. The brass horns and pianos that fill the air carry more than notes. They carry memory, and among those memories, the Axeman still walks a shadow between the beats. Perhaps that is what makes him so haunting. Not the blood, not the axe, not even the letter, but the fact that he became something more, a story that blurs the line between fear and art, between violence and rhythm, between the darkest parts of human nature and the brightest sounds of human creativity. In the end, the Axeman's legacy is not only the lives he took, but the music he left behind. Jazz, born in the heart of New Orleans, carries with it the echo of that strange night in 1919, when the city played louder than death. And in that echo, the Axeman still listens. The Axeman of New Orleans was never caught, never named, never placed behind bars. And because of that silence, theories about his identity multiplied like smoke in the night. Everyone had an answer, and no one had proof. To this day the question lingers, who was he? One of the earliest theories pointed toward the mafia. Many of the victims were Italian grocers, families who ran small corner stores. In the early 20th century, Italian immigrants in New Orleans faced prejudice but also whispers of organized crime connections. Some suspected the attacks were vendettas, warnings, or extortion schemes gone wrong. The brutality, the use of axes, the targeting of households with ties to groceries, all seemed, to some, like the signature of a criminal network. But the mafia theory had cracks. If the attacks were about money or territory, why were valuables left untouched? Why kill indiscriminately, even children? And why write a letter to the newspapers, taunting the entire city? Organized crime thrives on profit, not chaos. The Axeman seemed to thrive on fear itself. Others believed he was a madman, someone who killed at random with no more reason than compulsion. The sheer brutality of the attacks supported this idea. Families struck as they slept, blows delivered with a rage that felt personal, even when no personal connection existed. The randomness of the victims, Italians, yes, but also others, suggested that perhaps he was not choosing based on ethnicity or occupation, but opportunity. A madman slipping through neighborhoods, seizing weapons of convenience and vanishing into the night. This theory, while chilling, fit the unpredictability of the crimes, but it left questions. How could a lone lunatic evade capture for so long in a city swarming with police? How could he break into so many homes without ever being seen clearly, without ever leaving a trace that could hold up in court? Madness might explain motive, but it did not explain the phantom-like ability to escape. The most enduring name tied to the Axeman was Joseph Mumphrey, sometimes called Frank Mumphrey. His story is a tangle of rumor and fragmented records. Some claimed he was a small-time criminal with ties to extortion schemes targeting Italian grocers. Others painted him as a violent drifter who drifted in and out of New Orleans at just the right times. Years later, in the early 1920s, he was allegedly shot and killed in Los Angeles by a woman named Esther Albano, the widow of one of the Axeman's suspected victims. Newspapers at the time spun the tale as revenge, that Albano had tracked down her husband's killer and executed him in cold blood. The headline-friendly story stuck, and Mumphrey's name became forever linked to the Axeman legend. But here, too, the truth slips away. Court records about Mumphrey are spotty. Some historians argue the revenge killing never happened, as described. Others insist Mumphrey's crimes were real but unrelated to the Axeman. The story is seductive, a widow avenging her husband by killing the city's most infamous phantom. Yet seductive does not mean true. Without hard evidence, Mumphrey remains as much a ghost as the killer himself. Police files from the time are filled with suspects who were arrested, interrogated, and released. A German immigrant was accused. A jealous lover was blamed. A series of burglars and drifters were hauled in, questioned, and dismissed. Each time, the city held its breath, hoping the nightmare was over. Each time the Axeman slipped back into the shadows, proving again that he was not just a man to be caught, but a myth being born. The problem with identifying the Axeman was simple. He left nothing behind but fear. Unlike Jack the Ripper, who left taunting letters tied to specific crimes, the Axeman's only confirmed communication was the jazz letter. Theatrical, yes, but not proof. Unlike other killers, he left no calling card beyond the blunt force of his attacks. He was not seen clearly, not described in detail, not traced through forensics. In a time before modern investigative tools, he was almost impossible to pin down. And that is why the theories remain endless. Some still say mafia, some still say madmen. Some swear by the Mumphrey tale. Others insist he was a figure who vanished into the crowd after 1919, living out his life unnoticed, his crimes buried under ordinary years. Whoever he was, he succeeded in something rare. he erased himself from history while leaving his shadow behind. For New Orleans, that shadow became part of the city's folklore. People spoke of him not as a man but as a presence, the Axeman, not Mr. So-and-so. By stripping him of a name, the city ensured he would never truly die. He became a mask anyone could wear, a phantom anyone could fear. That was his greatest power. And perhaps that is why the mystery of his identity has never been solved, because the Axeman was not just a person. He was a story that could not be confined to one man's face, one man's name, one man's grave. He was larger than that, a figure who thrived in the shadows of uncertainty, whose identity is less important than the fear he created. To this day, scholars, detectives, and armchair historians argue over his name. But the truth is, the Axeman belongs to no single man. He belongs to New Orleans, to its music, its myths, its memory, and that, perhaps, is why he was never caught. Because in the end, the Axeman was never just in the streets. He was in the story itself. By late 1919, the reign of the Axeman began to flicker out. The brutal killing of the Courtimidia child had marked the height of his violence, the point where fear consumed every corner of New Orleans. Yet after that, the attacks slowed, then ceased altogether. The city waited, bracing for another night of screams. Another headline splashed across the Times-Picayune, but none came. Weeks turned to months, months into years, and the Axeman seemed to dissolve into the shadows that had once protected him. The silence was unsettling. People did not know whether to believe he had been caught in another crime elsewhere, fled the city entirely, or simply chosen to stop. Some whispered he had been killed, his body lying in an unmarked grave with no one ever knowing they had buried the phantom. Others imagined him walking among them, still alive, an ordinary man in daylight whose hands had once swung an axe in the dark. The possibility that he had simply returned to anonymity frightened people most of all. Police files remained open, thick with statements and photographs, but no new leads came. The suspects brought in had been released, the Giordano's exonerated, and every theory ran dry. Without fresh attacks, the case grew cold. The detectives who had worked it moved on to other crimes. For a city battered by poverty, prejudice and political corruption, the energy to chase a ghost eventually faded. But the people never forgot. The sudden end of the killings puzzled investigators as much as the crimes themselves. Serial killers, as history shows, rarely stop voluntarily. They are caught, killed, or die, but they seldom simply disappear. That is what made the Axeman different. He had written a letter promising bloodshed, tied himself to the sound of jazz, and terrified an entire city, and then, he vanished. Like a spectre, he was gone without explanation. For New Orleans, his silence became as legendary as his crimes. In taverns and barbershops, people asked, where did he go? Had the mafia silenced him? Had he taken his own life? Had a grieving family found him and delivered their own justice? No answer ever came, and so the questions multiplied, each one feeding the legend. The newspapers eventually shifted to new stories, but the memory of the Axeman lingered. Survivors bore the scars. Children who grew up in 1919 remembered sleeping to the sound of jazz bands echoing through the streets. Parents remembered clutching shotguns and lanterns through sleepless nights, and musicians remembered the strange moment when their art became a shield against death. Decades later, historians would revisit the case, combing through the yellowed pages of police files and trial transcripts. Some pointed to the possibility of Joseph Mumphrey, others insisted it had been multiple attackers, crimes wrongly strung together under a single name, but none of the evidence ever held. The longer the silence stretched, the more the mystery hardened. The disappearance of the Axeman turned him into something larger than a killer. He became a figure of folklore, like the Phantom of the French Quarter, like the ghostly legends of pirate Jane Lafitte, like the Flying Dutchman at sea. The fact that he stopped without warning made him seem less human and more myth, as though he had returned to whatever darkness had birthed him. For the families who had lost loved ones, the silence was cruel. They wanted justice, names, answers. Instead, they were left with nothing. The killers of their husbands, wives, and children were never punished. Their grief became part of the city's greater myth, folded into the story of the Axeman until individual suffering was overshadowed by legend. And perhaps that was his final triumph. By vanishing, the Axeman guaranteed that he could never be diminished by arrest or trial. He was never reduced to a mugshot, never confined to prison walls, never defined by an ordinary human name. He remained instead a shadow, eternal, untouchable, unknowable. In the end, New Orleans moved forward. The 1920s brought the full bloom of jazz, prohibition, and the rise of dance halls that made the city famous worldwide. But always in the background, in the stories whispered by older generations, the Axeman lingered. His crimes had lasted only a short time, but his presence stretched far longer, echoing like a drumbeat beneath the music of the city. To this day, visitors to New Orleans can hear his story on ghost tours and in jazz clubs. They are told of the night when the city played music to save itself, of the families who lived and died in silence, of the phantom who walked away and never returned. The guide's lantern flickers, the trumpet plays faintly in the distance, and for a moment it feels as though the Axeman might still be out there listening. Because the truth is, the Axeman never had to be caught to win. He wanted fear, he wanted myth, and in his disappearance, he gained both forever. The Axeman of New Orleans was more than a criminal who escaped justice. He became a legend, one of the city's most enduring stories, a figure who haunts not only crime history, but also music, folklore, and popular culture. Long after his acts fell silent, his presence continued to echo in ways that few killers ever achieve. In the years following the attacks, his story became inseparable from the soul of New Orleans. Tour guides told it on darkened streets, parents whispered it as cautionary tales, and musicians wove it into their art. The infamous letter demanding jazz gave the city a story unlike any other, a night when music became armor, when survival itself was tied to rhythm. That image, bizarre and surreal, refused to fade. In a city where jazz was already becoming a defining sound, the Axeman had etched it into crime history forever. Almost immediately, music responded. In 1919, a song was published titled, "The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz Don't Scare Me Papa." Its playful lyrics turned terror into satire, mocking the absurd bargain of playing music to escape death. The sheet music spread widely, and people played it with nervous laughter, remembering the night when they had done the same for real. Few killers have inspired music directly, but the Axeman had become part of the soundtrack of his city. Writers, too, embraced the story. Newspapers sensationalized the crimes, exaggerating details and fueling myths. Later, true crime historians would revisit the case, debating suspects and weighing theories. Novelists and short story writers adapted his legend, blending fact with fiction, often emphasizing the surreal marriage of jazz and death. The Axeman became a character, a symbol, a mask that could be worn in any retelling. In popular culture, he has reappeared again and again. Documentaries revisit his crimes, framing them alongside other infamous unsolved mysteries like Jack the Ripper or the Zodiac Killer. Television shows have dramatized his story, including an entire arc in American Horror Story, Coven, where the Axeman was portrayed as both killer and ghost, tied eternally to New Orleans. Each retelling shifts him slightly, but the essence remains the faceless figure who struck with an axe and vanished into myth. Locally, the Axeman became woven into New Orleans folklore. Ghost tours in the French Quarter almost always include his tale, guiding visitors past the streets where he once walked, telling of the night when jazz saved the city. In these retellings, the Axeman is less a man and more a spirit, a presence that lingers in the humid air, a phantom that listens for silence and punishes those who do not fill it with music. For historians, his legacy lies in the questions he left behind. Was he truly a lone madman, compelled by violence? Was he part of organized crime, his attacks tied to extortion? Or was he Joseph Mumphrey, the shadowy figure rumored to have died in Los Angeles years later? The absence of answers makes the case irresistible. Unlike solved crimes which fade once the culprit is named, the Axeman remains forever open-ended, forever debated, and in that uncertainty lies his power. What makes the Axeman stand out among killers is not just his violence, but the way he blurred into art. Jazz, born in the streets of New Orleans, was already revolutionary, chaotic, improvisational, alive. To tie such a joyous form of music to survival in the face of murder created a contrast so strange that it demanded retelling. The Axeman was not just a killer with an axe. He was a killer who made music part of his legend, and that fusion of horror and art is why his story endures. Even today, his name is used as shorthand for mystery and menace. Journalists write that a deserted building is like the Mary Celeste, and that a faceless predator is like the Axeman. He stands alongside the great unsolved figures of history because he left more than victims. He left a story that refuses to close. But his legacy is not only cultural. For the families of his victims, the scars lasted generations. Their names, Maggio, Bissouma, Schneider, Romano, Cortimiglia, became part of the city's tragedy, often overshadowed by the myth of the Axeman himself. While the world remembers the phantom, their descendants remember the blood. In this way the legend both immortalizes and erases, turning real suffering into folklore. And yet, in New Orleans, this blending of joy and sorrow, music and death, myth and reality, feels almost natural. The city has always carried both celebration and mourning in the same breath. Funerals with jazz bands, parades that honor tragedy with rhythm. The Axeman, in a strange way, became part of that duality. He was horror set to music, fear written in the key of jazz. That is why, more than a century later, the Axeman of New Orleans still matters. He is not just a figure from crime history, he is a reminder of how humans transform even the darkest terror into story, into sound, into memory. He is proof that myth can be born not from certainty, but from the lack of it. The Axeman has been gone for over 100 years, but in New Orleans, on a humid night when jazz drifts through the streets, it is easy to imagine he is still out there, listening. The Axeman of New Orleans disappeared as suddenly as he arrived. His axe fell silent, his shadow vanished, and no one ever faced justice for the families he destroyed. But the silence he left behind was not peace. It was the kind of silence that lingers, heavy and uneasy, like a note held too long in a jazz song, vibrating long after the instrument stops playing. His reign of terror lasted barely over a year, yet it carved itself permanently into the memory of the city. Each victim's name became part of a larger story. The Magios, whose throats were cut as they slept. The Bessumers, struck down above their store. Anna Schneider, who survived while pregnant. Joseph Romano, who stumbled bleeding before collapsing into death. The Cortimiglias, whose young daughter never saw another sunrise. Behind every headline was a house filled with blood, a neighborhood filled with whispers, a city filled with fear. But unlike most killers, the Axeman did not fade into the ordinary archives of crime. He became something else, a myth, a mask, a figure larger than the man who wielded the blade. And it was not only his brutality that made him so, it was his letter, the single piece of writing that elevated him from predator to legend. In it, he declared himself a demon, a spirit, an unstoppable force, and he demanded music as the price of survival. It was absurd, surreal, theatrical, and unforgettable. On that one night in March 1919, the entire city of New Orleans obeyed. Jazz poured from every window, every bar, every corner. Trumpets blared, pianos hammered, clarinets wailed. People danced not for joy, but for survival. It was the strangest bargain a city had ever struck. Play music or die. And when dawn came, and no blood was spilled, the legend was sealed. The Axeman had proven his power, not only over life and death, but over culture itself. He had turned a city into his orchestra. And then, he vanished. No arrest, no trial, no body in the street. Just silence. That silence is what makes the story so haunting. If he had been caught, the mystery would have ended. If he had died, the headlines would have closed the chapter. But by disappearing, he became eternal. He was never reduced to a name, never captured in a photograph, never locked away in a cell. Instead, he remained faceless, shapeless, an echo rather than a man, and echoes do not die. They drift. They return. New Orleans moved on, as it always does. The 1920s brought parades, prohibition, and the explosion of jazz that carried the city's name across the world. But beneath the celebration, the story of the Axeman never disappeared. Parents told it to children. Musicians wrote songs about it. Writers turned it into fiction. And even now, over a century later, it is told on walking tours, whispered in bars, dramatized on screens. The Axeman became not just part of crime history, but part of the city's folklore, as inseparable from New Orleans as its music and its mysteries. And maybe that is the greatest terror of all. Not the axe, not the blood, but the fact that he became a story that refuses to end. A killer who transformed into a ghost. A man who became a myth. A silence that became a song. Because the truth is, no one knows who he was. A madman, a criminal with a grudge. Joseph Mumphrey, gunned down years later in Los Angeles. Or just a phantom, a name given to fear itself. Theories swirl, evidence falters, certainty dissolves. The Axeman remains unsolved, untouchable, unending. And so, his legacy lingers every time jazz fills the streets of New Orleans. In the bright notes of a trumpet, in the rolling rhythm of a piano, in the pulse of drums echoing through the quarter, the Axeman is there. Not in flesh, not in footsteps, but in memory. The city remembers the night it played louder than death. That is why his story still matters. Not because of who he was, but because of what he left behind. A reminder that fear and art can collide, that music can be both joy and shield, that silence can be more haunting than sound. So the next time you hear jazz drifting on a warm New Orleans night, think of the Axeman. Think of the letter that demanded music, the night the city obeyed, the silence that followed, and wonder, as people have for more than a century, if somewhere, somehow, he is still listening. The Axeman of New Orleans is remembered not just as a killer, but as a story, one that has outlived him by more than a century. His crimes were brutal, his presence terrifying, but it was his letter that transformed him from a shadowy figure into a legend. In it, he demanded that the city play jazz or face death, and the people obeyed. For one surreal night in 1919, New Orleans became an orchestra of survival, its streets echoing with music louder than fear. And then, without warning, he disappeared. No arrests, no trial, no name ever tied to the faceless figure. His silence was more haunting than his crimes, because it left the city with nothing to hold on to. No answers, no justice, no closure. He simply melted back into the darkness, leaving behind a trail of grief and a legend that refused to die. Over the years, his story became part of New Orleans itself. Tour guides tell it on lantern-lit streets. Musicians write songs inspired by it. Writers spin new theories and new fictions, each one blurring fact with myth. The Axeman became less of a man and more of a mask, a symbol of fear, chaos, and the strange way that art and violence can collide. Perhaps that is what makes him so unforgettable. Other killers are remembered for their names, their trials, their photographs. The Axeman is remembered for his absence. He was never seen clearly, never identified, never dragged into the light. And in that void, people filled the silence with imagination. To some, he was mafia. To others, a madman. To still others, Joseph Mumphrey, killed years later in another city. But no theory has ever closed the case. That is the power of the Axeman's story. It is not about answers. It is about questions, about the fear of being watched, the terror of footsteps in the night, the strangeness of a city playing music to keep death away. His crimes may have lasted little more than a year, but the legend they created will last forever. New Orleans has always been a city of sound, laughter, parades, brass bands, jazz rising through humid nights. But woven into that sound is silence. The silence of the houses where the Axeman struck, the silence of the families left behind, the silence of a killer who vanished without a trace. And so the story lingers, in the trumpet's cry, in the drum's rhythm, in the whisper of ghost tours and the pages of crime history. The Axeman still walks. He is not gone, because he was never truly caught. He remains in the story, in the music, in the mystery, a killer made immortal, not by justice, but by legend.